The morning felt ordinary until people noticed what was missing. There were no familiar flags hanging from public buildings, no local police at street corners, no voices on the radio that sounded like home. Instead, there were soldiers speaking a foreign language, notices pasted on walls overnight, and a silence that carried fear more loudly than any explosion. For much of Europe, this was how World War II truly began, not with battles at the front, but with occupation settling quietly into everyday life. Between 1939 and 1940, Nazi Germany expanded across Europe with shocking speed. Poland was invaded and crushed, followed by Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France. The collapse of these nations felt unreal to civilians who had believed modern wars would be slow and predictable. One moment there were governments, armies, and borders, the next, there were checkpoints, curfews, and orders that demanded obedience without explanation. Occupation arrived not as a single event but as a gradual tightening of control. Life under occupation was designed to feel permanent. German authorities moved quickly to control information, communication, and movement. Radios were confiscated or restricted, newspapers were censored, and public gatherings were limited. Curfews turned evenings into hours of enforced stillness. Food was rationed, travel required permission, and even casual conversations carried risk. People learned to measure their words carefully, never knowing who might be listening. Fear became a daily companion. Arrests happened suddenly and often without clear reason. Punishments were public and deliberate, meant to discourage even the thought of resistance. Entire families could suffer for the actions of one person. In this environment, most civilians focused on survival. Resistance seemed not only dangerous but pointless. The German military appeared too powerful, too organized, too ruthless to challenge. Yet obedience did not mean agreement. Occupation stripped people of more than freedom, it attacked dignity and identity. Local languages were discouraged, national symbols banned, and history rewritten to serve the occupiers' narrative. Teachers were forced to abandon their curricula, and students were taught to admire the very regime that had defeated them. These changes created a quiet but growing anger. People could tolerate hunger and fear, but being told to forget who they were felt unbearable. The earliest resistance did not announce itself. It did not look like rebellion in the traditional sense. Instead, it appeared in hesitation and refusal. Workers slowed production without explanation. Farmers hid food rather than surrendering everything. Railway employees caused delays that could not be easily traced. Clerks misplaced documents. These acts were small, often unplanned, and carried out by individuals acting alone. Yet together, they formed the first cracks in the structure of occupation. As months passed, individuals who shared this silent defiance began to recognize one another. Trust developed cautiously, often among friends, relatives, or colleagues who had known each other long before the war. Meetings were rare and informal, held in private homes, back rooms, or quiet outdoor spaces. No one spoke openly of resistance. Instead, understanding passed through tone, pauses, and shared frustration. Secrecy was not a strategy, it was survival. In cities like Paris, resistance first took shape through words rather than weapons. Underground newspapers appeared, printed secretly using stolen supplies and distributed by hand. These publications challenged official propaganda, reported Allied developments, and reminded readers that defeat did not mean consent. Reading them was dangerous, possessing them could lead to arrest. Still, people read them eagerly, often passing them on immediately to reduce risk. Truth itself became an act of defiance. In Eastern Europe, especially Poland, occupation was far more brutal from the beginning. Nazi policies there aimed not just at control but at destruction of culture and leadership. Schools were closed, universities banned, and intellectuals targeted. In response, resistance emerged quickly and with remarkable organization. Secret education networks operated in private apartments, where children and young adults studied history, literature, and science. Lessons were memorized instead of written down. Education became a form of rebellion, protecting a future that occupation tried to erase. Fear never faded. German patrols were unpredictable, and informers existed everywhere. Some collaborated out of belief, others out of fear or desperation. Underground members learned to live double lives: obedient in public, defiant in private. A smile on the street might hide anger and resolve. This constant performance was exhausting. People lived with the knowledge that discovery was not a possibility but a matter of time. Women and young people played crucial roles during this early phase. Women often moved with less suspicion and carried messages, hid documents, and maintained safe spaces. Young people memorized information and delivered it verbally, avoiding written evidence. Resistance adapted constantly, learning from mistakes and changing methods to survive. There were no manuals, no guarantees, only trial, error, and courage. By 1941, underground movements were still weak in military terms. Weapons were scarce, training almost non-existent, and open confrontation unthinkable. But resistance was no longer accidental. Small cells began to form, deliberately limiting contact with one another to reduce damage if discovered. Communication was cautious but expanding. The goal was patience. Resistance leaders understood that survival mattered more than action at this stage. Time, they believed, would change the balance of power. German authorities sensed unrest but struggled to contain something they could not clearly see. Arrests increased, punishments grew harsher, and repression intensified. Yet each act of brutality deepened resentment. Fear controlled behavior, but it could not fully control belief. Occupiers could demand obedience, but they could not command loyalty or erase memory. By the time the first shock of occupation faded, Europe had learned a dangerous lesson: silence alone would not protect it forever. What began as individual acts of hesitation and quiet refusal slowly transformed into something more deliberate. Across occupied countries, resistance stopped being accidental and started becoming intentional. Chapter 2 of the underground story is not about explosions or open fighting, it is about growth: careful, hidden, and persistent growth beneath a system designed to crush it. Between 1940 and 1941, daily life under occupation became more structured and more suffocating. German control tightened with new laws, stricter curfews, heavier rationing, and expanded surveillance. Civilians realized that occupation was not temporary chaos but an organized system meant to last. This realization changed attitudes. People no longer waited for normal life to return on its own. Instead, many began asking a dangerous question: if this was the new reality, how could it be quietly challenged? The answer emerged slowly through connection. Individuals who had acted alone began to seek others who felt the same frustration and anger. These connections were not dramatic. They formed through conversations that stopped just short of open rebellion, through shared risks, and through trust built over time. A factory worker noticed a colleague slowing production. A teacher met another who still whispered forbidden lessons. A student recognized the same anger in a friend's silence. From these moments, the underground began to take shape. Secrecy became the foundation of survival. Resistance groups avoided large gatherings and clear leadership. Instead, they formed small, independent cells where members knew little about anyone beyond their immediate circle. This structure was not ideological at first, it was practical. Arrests were frequent, and torture was used to extract information. Limiting knowledge meant limiting damage. Survival depended on caution, discipline, and restraint. Communication posed one of the greatest challenges. Written messages were dangerous, radios were monitored, and telephones were unreliable. Resistance adapted by relying on human memory. Messages were memorized and passed verbally. Codes were simple but effective. Meeting locations changed constantly. Couriers, often young people or women who attracted less suspicion, moved information across cities and borders. The underground learned that flexibility mattered more than perfection. One of the most powerful tools of resistance during this phase was information. Occupation depended heavily on controlling truth, and resistance understood this. Underground newspapers multiplied across Europe, especially in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These publications corrected propaganda, shared news from Allied broadcasts, and reminded readers that they were not alone. They avoided dramatic promises, focusing instead on credibility. In a world built on lies, honesty itself became revolutionary. In Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, resistance continued to focus heavily on preserving culture and education. Secret schools expanded, and underground universities operated despite extreme danger. Students studied history, science, and literature in private homes, fully aware that discovery could mean death. These efforts were not symbolic. They were strategic. Resistance leaders believed that survival without identity was meaningless, and that rebuilding after the war would require educated minds. As underground networks grew, so did their responsibilities. Helping people in danger became a central mission. Jews facing persecution, escaped prisoners of war, and political enemies of the Nazis needed hiding places, food, and forged documents. Safe houses appeared in ordinary homes, farms, and apartments. False identities were created with remarkable skill. Each rescue carried enormous risk, not only for those being helped but for entire families. Still, many chose to act, driven by conscience rather than certainty. Women emerged as some of the most critical figures in this stage of resistance. They organized logistics, maintained communication lines, and managed safe houses. Their roles were not secondary, they were central. Occupying forces often underestimated them, allowing resistance networks to function more effectively. At the same time, young people played key roles as messengers and observers, moving information with speed and confidence born from necessity. German authorities responded with increasing brutality. Raids became more frequent. Arrests targeted not just suspects but entire communities. Collective punishment was used to discourage cooperation with resistance. Villages were fined, hostages taken, and public executions carried out as warnings. These measures created fear, but they also revealed weakness. The occupiers were reacting, not fully controlling. Resistance groups learned from every crackdown, adapting their methods and tightening security. By late 1941, the underground had developed a shared understanding of its purpose. It was not yet about open confrontation. Weapons were scarce, and military training minimal. Direct attacks would only lead to destruction. Instead, resistance focused on preparation. Intelligence gathering became more systematic. Members observed troop movements, supply routes, and administrative patterns. This information was carefully stored or passed to trusted contacts, laying groundwork for future cooperation with Allied forces. Psychologically, this period was the most exhausting. Living a double life demanded constant vigilance. Ordinary activities, shopping, working, greeting neighbors, became performances. Trust was fragile. Any mistake could be fatal. Yet people continued. What sustained them was not optimism but meaning. Resistance gave purpose to suffering. It transformed fear into choice and passivity into quiet action. The underground also began to understand itself as part of something larger. Radio broadcasts from abroad, though risky to listen to, connected occupied Europe to the outside world. News of resistance elsewhere inspired confidence. People realized that they were not isolated acts of defiance but pieces of a continental struggle. This awareness strengthened resolve and patience. By 1941, what had started as whispered defiance and small acts of non-cooperation began to transform into something far more organized and deliberate. Across occupied Europe, underground movements moved beyond survival and secrecy, becoming coordinated networks capable of collecting intelligence, aiding the vulnerable, and preparing for larger acts of resistance. This period marked the critical transition from passive defiance to structured action, setting the stage for more visible confrontation in the years to come. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 changed the dynamics of resistance across the continent. Suddenly, the Axis powers were stretched across multiple fronts, and the possibility of defeating Nazi Germany seemed more plausible. Resistance groups seized the moment, recognizing that time and preparation could turn their survival into strategic advantage. These networks, once small and localized, began to communicate more deliberately, connecting cities and regions despite the constant risk of discovery. Communication remained a challenge. Letters could be intercepted, radios were monitored, and telephones were tapped. Resistance adapted by relying on memorization, codes, and trusted couriers. Messages passed through carefully planned chains of people, often using young individuals or women to carry vital information. These couriers moved across towns and borders, memorizing locations, instructions, and sometimes entire lists of names. Security was paramount. The survival of the network often depended on one person's ability to remember a detail accurately while avoiding suspicion. Intelligence gathering became one of the most important roles of the underground. Observers mapped troop movements, recorded supply routes, monitored military installations, and noted strategic changes. Information collected by civilians reached Allied forces, providing insights that professional armies sometimes lacked. In some cases, these details directly influenced bombing missions, supply disruptions, and military planning. Intelligence was no longer just preparation, it was action in itself. Sabotage also became a central method of resistance. Unlike the early years, when defiance was mostly symbolic, 1941–1943 saw targeted destruction designed to hinder German operations. Railway lines were damaged to slow troop movements. Bridges were destroyed. Factories producing military equipment were sabotaged from within. These operations were highly dangerous. Discovery could mean immediate execution, yet the strategic impact of such sabotage demonstrated that resistance had grown from symbolic gestures to practical intervention. Helping persecuted populations remained a critical mission of underground groups. Jews, political dissidents, escaped prisoners of war, and others targeted by the Nazis were hidden in homes, farms, and secret shelters. False documents were created to provide new identities. Escape routes were developed, often through forests, mountains, and even across seas to neutral countries. Each act of aid carried tremendous personal risk. For many, the moral imperative outweighed fear. Protecting human life became both a practical and symbolic form of resistance. Women played indispensable roles during this period. They acted as organizers, messengers, and caretakers of safe houses. Their movements were less scrutinized by occupying forces, which allowed them to maintain communication networks and transport sensitive materials. Young people, too, were critical in memorizing information, observing troop activities, and transporting messages. Together, women and youth provided flexibility and adaptability to underground operations, often carrying out duties that would have been impossible for men under strict surveillance. German responses to underground activities became more brutal as resistance grew. Raids were frequent and unpredictable. Arrests often included entire families or communities. Torture was used to extract information, and executions served as warnings. Yet these measures revealed the limitations of German control. Even in the face of fear, resistance networks adapted and survived. Each crackdown taught new lessons, prompting changes in communication methods, meeting locations, and operational security. Fear remained constant, but it was no longer enough to extinguish defiance. By 1942, resistance movements began to operate with a clearer understanding of strategy. Cells were organized with limited knowledge of each other, reducing the risk of total collapse if one group was discovered. Members were trained in discreet observation, information transfer, and basic sabotage techniques. Although they lacked conventional weapons and large-scale armies, these movements developed specialized skills suited to guerrilla-style disruption and intelligence work. In addition to military and logistical efforts, resistance continued to focus on sustaining morale and identity. Underground newspapers multiplied, providing a counter-narrative to German propaganda. Cultural preservation remained a priority, particularly in Eastern Europe, where secret schools, libraries, and study groups maintained education and national heritage despite constant threat. This emphasis on intellectual survival underscored the understanding that liberation was not just military, it was social, cultural, and psychological. Resistance during this period also began to coordinate with external Allied forces when possible. Intelligence collected by civilians was sent to Britain and other Allied nations, forming a bridge between occupied populations and military planners abroad. While direct contact was risky, these links allowed the underground to contribute meaningfully to the broader war effort. The realization that their work had impact beyond local survival strengthened resolve and reinforced purpose. This era of underground activity was psychologically demanding. Members lived double lives, performing routine daily activities while secretly engaging in highly dangerous operations. Trust was fragile, yet indispensable. Each decision had to balance risk and reward. Mistakes could destroy networks and cost lives. Despite this, the dedication of resistance members remained unwavering. They operated with the knowledge that their actions, however small, were part of a larger struggle for freedom. By the end of 1943, underground movements had evolved significantly. They were no longer isolated groups of civilians acting spontaneously. They had become organized, trained, and disciplined networks capable of intelligence gathering, sabotage, and humanitarian efforts. Resistance had proven that ordinary people, even under extreme oppression, could coordinate and execute complex operations. They had created structures capable of surviving the harshest circumstances and contributing strategically to the defeat of occupying forces. By 1943, the underground movements that had begun with whispered defiance and small acts of survival had matured into organized networks ready for bold, strategic action. Europe remained under the control of Nazi Germany, but the balance of fear and power had begun to shift. The resistance was no longer simply surviving, it was acting, sabotaging, gathering intelligence, and preparing to strike in coordination with the larger Allied war effort. Chapter 4 tells the story of how these shadows turned into open resistance and ultimately shaped the liberation of Europe. The turning point for many resistance groups came as the tide of war shifted. Germany's initial dominance began to falter with setbacks on the Eastern Front and increasing pressure from Allied forces. Resistance movements recognized that this was the moment to move beyond preparation and passive acts. They expanded operations, coordinated more deliberately, and aimed to disrupt the occupiers' ability to control territory. Cities, towns, and rural areas all became active zones of defiance. Sabotage intensified in scale and impact. Railways, factories, communication lines, and military installations became targets. Unlike earlier years, these operations were planned with precision and often coordinated across multiple cells. Delays in troop movements, disruptions of supply chains, and destruction of key infrastructure began to have strategic effects. Sabotage was no longer symbolic, it was a form of warfare in its own right. Each successful act of destruction weakened German authority, demonstrating that occupation could be challenged even from the shadows. Intelligence collection reached its peak during this period. Underground networks continued to observe troop movements, supply routes, and military installations. Information was passed to the Allies, often at great personal risk. The intelligence collected helped shape strategic decisions, including bombing raids, amphibious operations, and liberation plans. In France, for example, resistance networks provided critical details that contributed to the success of the D-Day invasion in 1944. Across Europe, civilians' careful observation turned into a weapon as powerful as any army. Direct uprisings became more frequent as resistance groups gained confidence and opportunity. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 stands as one of the most notable examples. Polish resistance fighters attempted to liberate their city from German control ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. Though ultimately crushed with terrible loss of life, the uprising demonstrated extraordinary courage and the willingness of underground networks to act openly despite overwhelming odds. Similar uprisings, smaller in scale, occurred throughout France, Italy, and other occupied regions, showing that resistance was no longer confined to secrecy. Women and young people continued to play indispensable roles during this phase. Women maintained communication lines, organized logistics, and assisted in sabotage and intelligence operations. Young people carried messages, observed military movements, and provided critical local knowledge. Their contributions allowed the resistance to operate flexibly and respond to changing circumstances with speed. The underground's ability to involve civilians of all ages reinforced its resilience and effectiveness. Humanitarian efforts remained central to the resistance's work. Hiding Jews, political dissidents, escaped prisoners, and other targeted individuals continued despite increasing danger. Safe houses, escape routes, and forged documents were maintained with meticulous care. Protecting human life was both a moral imperative and a strategic necessity. Resistance fighters understood that victory was not only about defeating the occupiers militarily, it was also about saving civilians, preserving society, and protecting the values that occupation sought to destroy. In France, resistance networks coordinated closely with the Allies to prepare for liberation. Members of the underground provided intelligence, sabotaged railways and factories, and supported Allied parachute drops of weapons and supplies. These actions directly contributed to the success of the Normandy landings, allowing Allied forces to advance more rapidly once the invasion began. The resistance had become a force multiplier, civilians acting strategically alongside professional armies. Germany's response grew increasingly desperate. Executions, mass arrests, and village reprisals were intended to intimidate populations and crush uprisings. Yet repression had diminishing returns. By 1944–1945, the occupiers were fighting a multi-front war and struggling to maintain control over increasingly defiant populations. Resistance members adapted quickly to setbacks, learned from each operation, and continued to take calculated risks. Courage, patience, and strategic thinking allowed underground movements to persist even in the face of overwhelming force. By the final years of the war, underground movements were no longer shadows, they were integral to liberation efforts. Cities once under tight German control became arenas of coordinated uprisings. Rural areas disrupted supply lines, provided refuge for fleeing populations, and offered strategic advantages to advancing Allied forces. Resistance fighters were no longer simply observers, they were active participants in shaping the outcome of the war. The legacy of these movements extended beyond immediate military contributions. Underground networks preserved culture, education, and identity during years of oppression. They provided a model of civilian courage and coordination that influenced post-war reconstruction and national identity. Resistance was not just about defeating an enemy, it was about sustaining society, ensuring the survival of values, and laying the foundation for freedom.